Welcome to the FRCL Weekly Call. We're a group of distribution leads who get together regularly to discuss works in progress, share ideas, and create opportunities for cross-distro collaboration.
Hey everybody, it is the 25th of February. We are leads in Fedora, RHEL, and CentOS, thus FRCL. And we're back after 2 weeks. When we met 2 weeks ago, the most votedest thing that we wanted to talk about was not just like sharing something was going on. It was, hey, let's actually collaborate on a thing. And that thing was the idea that there is a sort of unity in perception of Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL, but we all act independently. And wouldn't it be cool if we showed up in a more unified way? So this was Scott's thing that he brought up in a massive session of brainstorming. And Scott, I think you've got some groovy slides to share so we can talk through this, see where it goes.
Yes, give me 1 second. I'll bring up something. This will also just be, I should preface this with, this is literally like a 60% just throw out an idea. Nothing is set in stone. Don't get offended by anything, but I just want to like have some kind of straw man to throw darts at and think about and guide the conversation.
Yeah, showing up with finished work here is actually the bad thing. Like we're here to show the incomplete stuff so that we can do things together.
Exactly. So I say that with, I will also fully commit that or admit that I put this together. You know, I had pretty decent thoughts, but like I just threw it together in AI. I will fully confess that. So if anything is like a little bit wonky, please forgive me. I went back and refreshed my mind with a call last week. Thank you to Brandon. And kind of just tried to pull together like something, just a straw man and throw darts at and see like if we could think about the problem again. But basically the gist was like, what could we do that kind of makes us all like, what is the overarching thing that would get us excited to think about solving some shared problems, basically, right? Because if a group of people gets together with no mission, it just kind of flounders around and it turns into not as productive, definitely not as fun. And so why is this not switching? Sorry, I am trying to switch the slide. It is not doing anything. Okay, finally, it is doing something. Okay, so I asked myself, based on our call and everything we recorded and analyzing it again, like when you think of Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL, this is an actual quote from our call last week. You know, it's like people don't understand. They view it as one thing, right? Like from the outside, the world kind of views it that way. And when they compare it to other Linux distros, they're like, hey, that Fedora, yeah, I was thinking about that too. But normally this works, Brandon, and I have pretty good internet at home, but apparently something's going. Anyway, the gist is like, how can we get ourselves to think about like, what do the users get? What do we get? Like we have to admit to ourselves, like we get energy if we're working on something that's cool and we love it, right? Like, and if we feel strongly about the problem that we're solving, then I will work extra hours. It's kind of how human nature is. So we definitely got to think about like, what do the users get? We got to think about what do we get? And then like, can we focus on making the ecosystem better for everybody, basically? Because we are users and contributors. Let me see. I think this might be a different problem. I think this might actually be my computer because I have a lot of things running. What is happening? Let me go back from slideshow and try this again. There we go. Okay. And so feel free to cut in at any time, by the way. I don't want to talk this whole time. I'm just throwing this out there as ideas. But if you look at us the three groups, you know, it's kind of disconnected, opaque, confused, like nobody kind of understands exactly where to participate, what to do. I realized that like perhaps I was thinking about branding too much when really it's probably, in a lot of ways, it's just like a strategic alignment problem. Like if we don't have a shared mission of some kind, and it doesn't have to be like an overarching mission. Like you said, we we all act independently. But even if like 10% of what we focus on is a cool shared mission, that would be kind of cool, right? It feels like it would at least be some shared goals. So one of the things that I wanted to share from our side, from the Red Hat side, the RHEL side, is this is kind of how we operate. Like, I'm not saying we have to operate that in the space that all three of us operate in, but I at least wanted to share how we operate with a little bit of drawing. Everything is kind of focused around what we call a market problem. And this is not a technical story. This is like hey, it's confusing for me to understand where to contribute my patch. Like, that would be a market problem, right? Like, I don't know where to contribute my patch if I want to get something into the RHEL, Fedora, CentOS ecosystem. Or another example of a market problem might be I submit a patch and it takes forever to get to XYZ. It takes forever to get into Fedora. It takes forever to get into CentOS. It takes forever to get into RHEL. Those would be market problems. I will share a story. I did this yesterday with an upstream project. I was actually hacking on some stuff with Claude Code, as crazy it is. Submitted it. It had some autoresponder, AI autoresponder that from Gemini that responded. Then the guy that accepted the patch had Claude Code as well. And like, I literally went from writing a blog about how they should use my fork to, oh wait, I need to update the blog because I got distracted because the guy's already accepted my patch 3 hours and 1 minute later. So like, I think that's like a general business problem. I mean, obviously feature in that. Let me talk about that in the sense of a feature, right? Features are things like automated responders, you know, like this guy had an AI responder, but like he had implemented features that resolved that market problem for this project, right? Like he had implemented all kinds of automatic code review and all kinds of, like, honestly, I was blown away by how automated the entire interaction between me and this other human being is. Like, each of us did like 5% of the work and the rest was done by automation. But the gist is, from a market problem perspective, slow acceptance of patches is like a market problem. Confusing, don't know where to submit patches, a market problem. Features are things that like help retire that. And so you might say, oh, we need an AI, your automated responder that like code reviews. That's a feature. And then you may say, oh, I need to go implement Gemini or Claude as the epic. And then there may be stories around that, like setting up all the bits and bytes in like GitLab or GitHub or whatever, GitHub Actions, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that's kind of how we look at this from a market problem. This is a made up market problem, by the way, that I just am highlighting. But like, that's the gist of how we tackle them internally. Does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone still hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay.
I do want to point out that it's very interesting that your shared language is structured the way it is, because this is pretty much the way I file every ticket in the RHEL Jira. Like, I file every single ticket that I make against any RHEL component in exactly that format.
Yeah, technically we call the market problems outcomes, and they're a subtype because long story reasons. But like, yeah, this is how the PM team views it, basically. But go ahead, Brent. Yeah, so I'm glad that you were able to grok that, Neal, from the, but go ahead, Brendan.
Hey, Scott, can we just take a 2-minute segue and talk about what these words mean and how they map to how RHEL uses Jira? Because I want to be sure everyone's hearing the same thing, because all of these are keywords that have Jira meanings and RHEL BU meanings, but they might not be the same English meaning.
Yeah. Do you want me to like explain an example one that everyone's familiar with, like Bootsy or something?
That'd be super.
Yeah. So like, for example, in the lead up to RHEL 10, we were working heavily on Bootsy, obviously. Like, there was a ton of Red Hatters working on that. There was a market problem. Like, it is hard to deploy software stacks, in particular when they require specialized hardware and drivers. Deploying entire software stacks that rely on hardware things is how I would describe the market problem. I don't remember the exact words of it, but that was one of the main ones for Bootsy. Like, the problem it was supposed to solve was, hey, I'm a user, whether that's a sysadmin, architect, or developer, and I need to be able to deploy like PyTorch on AMD, right? Like that's a market problem, right? You're like, how do I do that? It's hard. There's all kinds of ways you could implement it, but the gist is there's no easy way to do that. There's actually, I should say, there's many easy ways and many hard ways to do that, right? So there's no when you're looking at the options ideas, you Google search that, you're going to find 22,000 ways to do it. And so like the question is, could you have like a single container file that just describes that, right? And then build the entire system. That was kind of the feature, if you will, was like, hey, you typically think of these market problems and features as a pair. You go, hey, what's the market problem? And you've kind of got to look at a feature so that you can kind of even understand what it is. But if you look at Boot C, it was like, all right, need to deploy an entire software stack all the way down to the bare metal with drivers and things. An example of that would be like using a container file to describe a PyTorch stack with all the drivers built into RHEL. That would be like the feature. And then you can imagine there was all kinds of epic and story work that had to happen to make that real. Everything from making things work in Image Builder as the front end to RHEL, all the way to like getting the images up. There were epics for like getting the Bootsy images up on our registry. There were epics for getting feature work into the Bootsy upstream project. But like when you start to think about this market problem, it touches all kinds of things, right? Some of the work happens inside of Red Hat. Some of it happens upstream, getting those Bootsy images. Some of it probably even drove stuff in Fedora. You know, there was probably, I would guess, I don't know off the top of my head, 20 epics or something, 20, 25, 30 epics that happened in the Bootsy lead up would be my guess. I don't know, maybe more. I don't know. I don't have it on the top of my, you know, I haven't looked at it, but there's, you can imagine like there were probably, call it 5 to 10 features helped retire that market problem, 20, 30 epics, hundreds of stories. Like that's kind of what it looks like internally. Does that help, Brendan?
It does. And I'll just add 2 more things. One is that most of the market problems and features are currently invisible if you're a community member. But at least in CLE and possibly for FRCL, both of which are public projects, we could create space for these things so that they show up in our mutual thing. So with that, back to you, Scott.
No, that is a good idea. Yes, the market problems and features live in we don't make those public, but some of the epics and stories are. Depends. There's all kinds of rules that I don't fully understand, to be honest with you. Engineering controls that. But like RFEs, and there's some other things that are public internally. But yes, what Brendan is saying, I suspect it would be much more rational if we adopt something similar to this, to just have something in the Fedora CentOS space that would like be public and people could see what we're doing, right? And like why we're going after things. I think this touches on the Fedora change proposals to an extent, and admittedly a bunch of things that I don't fully understand in Fedora, so I don't want to tiptoe into worlds I don't understand. But this is the gist of how we do it internally at Red Hat anyway. Then, oh, come on, computer, what are you doing? Oh, okay, so I kind of try to develop like a litmus test, right? Like if it's something that's it feels like this is the area where we want to focus us 3, right? Like obviously RHEL has its own business problems. We want to go make money, and nobody hates money. Fedora, you all have your own kind of things that you want to do, and then CentOS Stream, you have your own things that you want to go do. But it does feel like there's probably a decent overlap, right? Like there's some overlap of things that we would all 3 care about that we'd want to go after. And the fact that we got pretty good excitement in the last call made me excited to make this slide. I was like, I feel like there's something special here, and maybe we haven't viewed it this way before. And if we did, it feels like we could all get more excited about what we're doing and what we collaborate on. And so if it's felt across all 3 projects, that's cool. Let's try to like talk about that stuff in the FRCL chat, the FRCL call, et cetera, et cetera. And then like success helps us all, right? Like it promotes all of our brands and makes us look, you know, or makes us perceive, you know, helps our perception in the market, which is great. Again, from the RHEL perspective, I love that. That's how I think. I'm a product manager. But I think it also just makes us feel better about what we work on. Like, I just think I would feel, I mean, as a Fedora contributor or CentOS contributor, I would just feel better working on this. That's my thought. But I'm open to what people think. Yeah, exactly, Croy. That's a perfect example. Like the RISC-V stuff, NVIDIA stuff. Those are perfect examples of things where we all definitely collaborate. And there's a lot of confusion. So that would also maybe be an added benefit, is if we could have like better clarity about who's doing what in what project and why. That would be like the dream state, I think, maybe. Yeah, that's fair. Trying to get this slide to go. Okay, I guess if I click on it, it works, but my keyboard is not working. All right, so here's a candidate, just a dumb idea, like I'm throwing out there, like a business problem. This is one that I've been thinking about a lot. Is in RHEL, okay, I will say this out loud because I've talked about it enough publicly. I was targeting in RHEL 10 to sort of get to a 3-tier support policy. And I got there kind of, but we didn't fully announce it all the way. Like these things exist in RHEL today, but we didn't get, let me say this, I wanted to have a single page that basically just showed these 3 tiers because I think it would be easier for customers. That's a business problem that I think RHEL has. CNCF determined they had some similar problem, right? Because they came up with this thing called the CNCF sandbox, and they have this sandbox incubated and graduated tiering system, which looks strikingly similar to what I was kind of thinking in RHEL. And I went and analyzed the Ansible community, and they have something similar where they have like a community support, validated support, and certified content. Like they have 3 tiers. I think there's something here. Like this feels like a business problem that exists in, like, I should have put Fedora and CentOS, but like there's clearly, like when you look at Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL, sorry, again, this thing was generated by AI, so it generated how it generated it. But I would probably draw this slide a little bit differently where like it's Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL. Clearly there's some hunger to have some kind of 3-tier concept, like some concept of how mature are these pieces of technology that I want to use business problem, right? Like there's people that use Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL, and they're like, hey, I want to know how mature this thing is that I'm using. Like I'm pulling in these libraries. I'm whatever, building on this thing. Like that feels like a business problem that we all share. I don't know. This is probably the first place that we should probably discuss. But yes, please, if you want to discuss that. This is one that seemed interesting.
Yeah, so as I'm reading this and thinking about what you're saying, right? I think part of the reason why this is challenging to figure out for Fedora is there isn't, strictly speaking, a business context to map this to, right? Like, so there's the organizational context, and then there's the implementer's context, and then there's the marketable context, right? But we don't have, strictly speaking, in Fedora, we don't have something that connects them, something to be a concern for all of them at the same time, right? In RHEL, you have the business as the connective tissue for those 3 functions. And in CNCF, you have how Linux Foundation is going to raise money as the connective tissue. And in Ansible, you have how does Red Hat deal with customer confusion as the connective tissue. In Fedora, because we're so disconnected from Red Hat's product portfolio, and we're very disconnected from essentially the business structures of Red Hat, we don't have the Ansible problem where people say, well, okay, everything Fedora is doing, that means I absolutely now expect it in RHEL. There used to be this problem, but over the past 10 years, this has stopped being a thing people assume about Fedora, which has had its pluses and minuses. I personally think it's more of a plus than a minus, but your mileage may vary here. What I think of from entry, proven and fully backed, tends to be more along the lines of, like, how long does something stay in Fedora before it gets propagated into somewhere else, a downstream?
You're tiptoed into my next business problems. That I only have 3, and yes, you're tiptoeing into another angle that I looked at.
Yeah. It just started coming to my mind as we're talking about this. Is like there's the nth dimensions of, like, how do you think of this? It's not just like this flat table or tiers. It's actually probably closer to a spiral. Like there's a lot of those things that you would think about as you go through each of the stages or each of the implementation phases, each of the different considerations and that sort of thing.
But I agree, you can make it that complicated if you want. But again, go back to the business problem. What does the user want? Like, what does the end user want?
Okay, so Pat also has his hand up.
Yeah. So my inclination is to take sort of one further step back, because if you look at the organizations that you've listed there, CNCF is an organization that has sub things. And at a certain level, Red Hat is an organization that has sub things. And so I would suggest that Sandbox is Fedora, incubating is CentOS, and graduated is RHEL. And then internally, those organizations can chop things up in ways that make sense to them, because as Neal mentioned, Fedora isn't really attached to the RHEL BU plans. And that's like, I've been running Fedora on my desktop for years. It's stable and I love it. But my inkling is to go in that direction, but it's only like a third formed thought.
I must confess to you, Pat, something really funny, that when I had AI generate this slide, it actually drew it that way first, and I forced it back to this way. So perhaps you're actually right and I am wrong, but I don't know. I'm throwing it out there.
So I see why we would think that, but one of the things that I worry about is that I don't think that we want to cast RHEL as like the ultimate perfect thing. There is some stuff that we are doing with Fedora that is way better to use Fedora for than it is to use RHEL for. And there are some things that we do in CentOS with SIGs that make it the perfect place to do that thing, like nothing else. And so, Scott, my understanding of where you're headed with this is that usually technology moves through these three distributions, and the flow here is kind of the question, and how we talk about it as holistically is something that we don't do very well right now, that we want to do better at.
Yeah, and I think just here we just want to like see, like, is this problem even interesting to us, right? Like, is it interesting? It seems like it. We got a little bit of chatter about it, so it seems like this is at least an if this one is interesting to us, the next steps would be to hand it off to some subset group of people and let them go tackle it and figure out, like, come back with a straw man proposal and say, here's how we would solve it across the three. And then we would all, like, you know, see if we love it or hate it, or throw darts at it or modify it or whatever. But like, I think maybe this would be worth it, like, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I want to.
Oh, sorry, Steven. I didn't see your hand up.
Yeah, no worries. I agree with what's been said here by everybody, really. I kind of see this as a bit of a fractal. So like a fractal. That's hard to say. But depending on what level you're looking at, it changes. So it is true that Fedora to CentOS Stream to RHEL is one type of way. But like, if you dig in deeper, then you do start to see things like, okay, what would be that sandbox in Fedora? What would be proven general technology? What would be like, you know, primary architecture like thing on fully backed or that kind of stuff? But then it, you know, finding that level is important, because when you start talking about like hosted services or SaaS types, open source SaaS versus shipped technology, then that also changes, right? Somebody brought up QE, you know, dev QE stage and production. Yeah, that is accurate too. So I think really defining the level we're looking at here will define the outcome of terminology and how we apply it.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. So like, as a PM, I will share, like, whenever this is the response, people start talking about fractals and like complicated math things, that's usually an indication that there is actually a business problem here. like whatever you're like, oh God, I can't describe this, it's so complicated. You're like, yeah, that's a key indicator that there's something here that's worth exploring, because theoretically life shouldn't be that complicated, and you know, for basic things like this. So these at least feel like a +1. Something else interesting that I could offer up is we actually have an interesting scoring matrix that I shared. I think I've shared it with the team and publicly, where we used it for RHEL 11, and you kind of score, like, is this thing interesting, this market problem or this feature interesting? And that could be something interesting that the teams could use, or we could even go through it here to see if we like vote and think it's interesting. But I don't want to add too much rigor too quickly. I just want to at least see if we're interested in this first. Should I move on to the next one? Or no, Jef, please.
Yeah, as I said in the chat, I actually, and I apologize, I owe people the straw proposal that's in my head that addresses these question marks as a starting point to talk about it. I think there's something here that goes beyond what Scott's trying to talk to, that maps into how Fedora can innovate in a safer manner. And I think that actually fills those question marks really well. And like I said, I meant to get it out to people last week, and I just ran out of tuits and I'm on the hook for that. I'm hoping we can use that as a straw proposal to follow up on this conversation in a wider context as the first this week.
Yeah, Jeff, obviously I knew you were kind of working on that, so I didn't want to paint you into too much of a corner.
No. You need to call me out on the fact that I owe people things. Like, you got to hold me accountable for it.
No, it's fine. But yeah, I do think there's a business problem here. I think it's at least worth understanding and like digging into deeper and seeing if we like. I do think there's some use to thinking about across the three, right? Like, and go, what could we do? If that's it, I'll move on to the second one. All right, I got to go over here and actually tap. Okay, again, these are contribution clarity. This was another one that I think keeps coming up in my head when I started researching. Is like, I don't exactly know what this means, but like, I want to know my work will reach users. Like, that's definitely a feeling that I've had. Like, if I submit a PR to somebody, and like, I'm not going to lie, that feeling of you're like, all right, I'm going to live on this fork for who knows how long until I can get this thing accepted upstream, but I don't know where it goes and when it integrates and what I can use. That feels like a market problem that all of us care about, right? Like, whether you have Fedora users, CentOS Stream users, or RHEL users, they all kind of want to know that, right? And since we're all connected at the hip, like that pipeline makes us connected, right? Like we are technically wired together. So like, it feels like a problem that we should all care about because we kind of can't solve it unless we all solve it. I don't know. That's my thought. Does this make sense to everyone?
Yeah, I think so.
Getting good thumbs ups. All right, so that's interesting. So this feels like this one's less confusing. We kind of all understand it and grok it, and we're like, yeah, this is a long-term thing. Jeff, please.
I'm going to complicate it for you. That's the ideal, right? Where the flow is one way. But
fair.
What we get into trouble with is, I don't think we know how to handle it when we need to backflow a bit.
Yep.
I think that's where it gets super complicated for us, because I think this is what we have in our head as the ideal. This is how it should work. But if something shows up at the integration level or the enterprise level for reasons, how do we backflow that back up? And that's something I don't think we have a handle on.
Yep. I tend to agree. I will be more bold than you, and I'll say things like PQC, for example, like the post-quantum crypto. I could probably turn these tubes on the side and put Fedora on one, like kind of like a angle Fedora off the one side and angle CentOS Stream and RHEL off the other side, almost like a longer leg on one of the stools, and go, we did a bunch of work upstream, pulled it into CentOS Stream and then into RHEL, but we didn't necessarily fully pull it down into Fedora, and they kind of happened concurrently and kind of disjointedly. Yeah, that's a perfect example of like where it causes weird friction and pain and contribution clarity problems. Like, in fact, that's what I heard on the chat was a bunch of contribution clarity questions like about it. So it seems like a real business problem to me. Neal, please.
So you basically, with your hands, just described Brendan's Penrose triangle from like, I don't know, almost 10 years ago now.
Okay.
I remember his talk about this when it was just before, I think it was just before CentOS RHEL 8 happened the first time. And it was basically this thing of like, nothing happens in sequence and nobody knows what the sequence is supposed to be. And so everything is chaos right around the 1.5 year, the 2.5 year mark before a new RHEL release. Or in this case, when it was talking about the first time, it's like the indeterminate amount of time before somebody decides RHEL must happen. Because we hadn't gotten to a point of saying like RHEL should be released on a regular basis. But like my thought here is the pipes are nice, but I would like, I think there was a comment in the chat and it was along the same lines of what I was thinking. It's like, it's probably more of a funnel, because a pipe implies that everything slides through.
Yeah.
But there are multiple gates, and then there's either opaque and transparent gates that create filters for stuff that goes in. And what you probably actually want to have that funnel become more transparent rather than opaque as it currently is.
Yep.
So like, for example, I think about 68% of the features that I work on in Fedora never show up in CentOS or RHEL. So, and then the remaining ones, they show up randomly, as in like they show up when no one expects them to show up, and we're all caught off guard, right? Like, so that's where there's more breakdowns. Yeah, I was right. It was before RHEL. It was before RHEL 8. Block 2018. I watched the recording of that because I wasn't there in person, but I did remember watching it, and it was very interesting. I saw it again in person when he did it later, a second time, and it stuck even more. But like that talk is basically how I conceptualize both how it works and how it's broken, because we don't have. There is no clear guidance or clear understanding when Red Hat as a stakeholder has gone against, or ignored something that has been propagated through Fedora. And so that's the part I think that's missing the most. Or if they change their mind, which is actually the more surprising outcome.
So I think we're falling into that classic rat hole of, this is the thing I understand so clearly, I want to talk about it the most. So I think we're all familiar with this one. Scott, you've got another candidate you want to share?
I do have one more candidate, and I will say we have some time at the end to talk about like next steps that I think is exactly what Neal is chomping at the bit to actually get at.
Yeah, so let's hit number 3, and then we can talk about solving this problem for reals this time.
Yeah. So slightly different, but this is deeper. So like I would say the last one was about, all right, I submitted my thing in RHEL, Fedora, CentOS, whatever. This is even deeper. So one of the things that we've discovered from the RHEL side is that like if you create the RHEL 10.0 beta and then just throw it out and be like, hey, customers, come try this. They're like, meh. They're like, meh. It's like it's an OS, right? Like, what do I test on this? Like, I'm not going to put my production workloads on your beta. Like, there's a few small group, I would say 5%, 3%, 1%. I don't know. They're the highly motivated pro Red Hat technologists that are super into it. Myself included. I'm one of them probably. But I'm a bad model for that, right? Because like most people, in fact, even myself, I'm guilty of not really downloading all of the betas and testing them. And so what we discovered was actually we get much better engagement on the RHEL side anyway. We get much better engagement when it is co-developing technology. So like the boot C work was co-developed with the customers. And for example, Visa was on stage at Summit and had their own presentation at Summit last year. So what was that? Almost a year ago, 10 months ago. And it was really cool, like, because they had helped develop the technology with us. We're doing similar things with like the Hummingbird project that you see publicly announced. We have found that when you get people working with you on a specific technology to solve a specific business problem, you get a lot more engagement than you do if you throw out a beta. Like you're like, here's a beta. We've been working on it. By the way, it's almost finished. Oh, and we will barely have any time to change it within the next 6 months before we actually just give you the GA. Help us. And everyone's like, not that interested. I'll wait till 10.2 to deploy, which is a typical enterprise customer, right? So the question is like, we definitely see this problem on the RHEL side. The question is this a shared one in that center space? I suspect it is. Because like if I'm a partner, the NVIDIA one, somebody brought up in here, I want to kind of figure out how to feed my thing through. And it's not just a little change. It's like a major change, right? Like it could be like a major new technology development, like bootc or hummingbird images, or, who knows, something that I can't even, something we haven't even invented yet. Go ahead, Neal.
So I think this is less of a problem in the Fedora space than it is in the other ones, because there's an implied co-development loop that occurs as part of developing major changes and features and things like that. It's not said out loud, but it is essentially performed by default. Now, sometimes that doesn't happen, and then we get weird things, but I think by default, this has already been the way that things have been moving in the Fedora space for a while. So, people do actively test the betas and they give feedback.
Let me give you an example.
Because there's a co-development flow as part of it, which again, contrast with the betas that you guys did for RHEL. Like back when I was a RHEL partner and a RHEL customer that attempted to actively use the betas, I didn't find that there was a way for me to be engaged with Red Hat with the betas in the first place, right? So betas felt useless to me, not because they were so late in the process, but because they weren't designed as a mechanism to provide feedback. They were basically a release validation artifact and not a engagement artifact. And so you got to design it that way. In Fedora, they're already designed that way. They're designed as an engagement artifact. They happen as part of the release process, but they are designed to be engaged with. So that's kind of the thing. But I agree, this is a larger problem in the enterprise Linux space because we don't have this flow.
Yeah, Pat, you have your hand up too. And Jeff.
Yeah, so one of the ways in which I think about the power of these feedback loops is we have this wonderful, amazing CentOS hyperscale SIG, where they are working as customers on actual problems that they face in their actual environments.
Yep.
And I'm worried that if you want this continuous feedback loop, that you haven't spoken with the people who are deliberately building a thing because the current bits aren't quite right.
Yeah, that's an adjacent problem, I think, but I do hear you. I will say in general, I'll just say this out loud, the reason why a lot of those things haven't been implemented in RHEL is because it hasn't been a business problem that would make money in RHEL. Just being super transparent. That is typically why you do not see hunger from the RHEL side when something is happening in a SIG. It's typically oh, that's cool community work. That helps some community problems. It doesn't really seem like it would stick. It either grow into a new market or retain customers in current markets that RHEL hunts, basically, in a nutshell. Which I view as a slightly different problem than this. This is more let me say it this way, bootc, it would be very tough for me to say that bootc work was done in Fedora, then moved to CentOS, then moved to RHEL, right? It wasn't really. It was done in RHEL and then kind of inherited by, it was done upstream, let me say, probably the best way to describe it, then pulled into CentOS and RHEL, and then kind of half pulled into Fedora. That's probably another piece of this business problem in my mind. Does that make sense? Jeff, please.
Yeah, so we're fixing the bootc problem right now. I'll say that first. But I want to highlight the fact that, Yaakov points out that ELN exists, and ELN could be a continuous integration point where RHEL could work with customers in the context of the very first point where Fedora is vendored off into RHEL product.
Yep.
Right? That is what ELN is. And I think ELN is super interesting point to do the continuous integration. I think it could be utilized way more if we decided that was the way forward.
I tend to agree, and that sounds like a feature that would help retire this market problem.
And from Pat's point of view, for the CentOS SIGs, I also think there's a path forward for the community interest there to basically, if it doesn't conflict, right, can they also use ELN to basically service and push back up a little bit? I think what I know for sure is that ELN is definitely underutilized if you want to get to continuous integration. And that's all I want to say.
I think Yaakov had his hand up first. I don't know if he put it down by mistake.
I think Neal and I were going to say the same thing. Neal, do you want to go ahead and say what you
No,
think?
you should do it. It's more fun when you say it than when I say it.
I don't know
Everyone
about that.
takes you more seriously than me.
Anyway, so what I think we were both going to say was that we've actually had some very recent discussions. Neal and some of the other people from the community, some who may be on this call, about setting up what will essentially be an ELN hyperscale space to essentially serve as an upstream for CentOS hyperscale, not in a way that would not disturb, RHEL, but would serve as an upstream and a means for previewing and simplifying the on ramping of a new hyperscale. So those discussions are just happened in the last week or so. There's still a lot of implementation to figure out, but that there's place for that, and I think there's a way to make that work. And whatever ELN can do, without being a detriment to RHEL itself, of course, which is the core mission, but whatever we can add on to make things that are on top of the next RHEL happen faster, better, easier, sooner, whatever it is, I'm open to within reason.
Yeah, I love that. I will say this makes me excited, Yaakov. I have to be quick on time, but I did send some like emojis on that one because like this to me is exactly the beauty of like the three thinking together as one thing. Like if we can have an upstream in ELN and it lands in CentOS, and then CentOS goes off and helps other businesses with their problems, aka Meta. Like, cool. Like, that's great. Now there's a path to like do all of these things for the different constituencies. To me, that's amazing. Like, that shows the whole thing working together. It also shows that we have a shared business problem there, that SIGs are needed in both CentOS and Fedora. That's really cool to me. Like, that is exactly that's the market problem, basically, in a nutshell. Brendan, do you want me to move on quickly to the next two slides?
Yeah, I pulled my hand down. I was gonna rat hole us.
Yeah, no worries. Because we have 5 minutes and I want to at least land the airplane on time. So, focused on value, not governance exactly, right? Like, basically the idea is here, like all of this is like what the users get. Like, we are actually just focused on, amazingly, we just like pivoted into that mindset where we were like starting to think about like what users get. And I love that, because that is like, just even that last piece of conversation was amazing, because that is exactly where I was hoping we would get on our own. But I think the path forward is probably the most important slide. Like, if we find these market problems and others, like there could be others in there. In fact, I almost heard a couple others. I would be happy to like facilitate just like the organization of it. But like, I do think it would be worth, probably the most important part of this is the action. Form cross project working groups, like, get a representative from RHEL, Fedora, and CentOS in a room, mess with the market problem, develop some features that might retire it, brainstorm, dream, come back to the group, and then like propose them, right? Like, that feels like the right working way to do this. But I don't know. That's my thought. I think that's probably the most critical piece to talk about on this slide in my mind, is like, could we get to that level of action and be happy with ourselves? And if so, who's interested in what market problems? And does anyone have any other market problems they want to propose? But I will find trying to tackle too many will also burn you. So just a heads up. 1 to 3 is probably enough for us to all start and get our legs under us. That's just my experience doing this internally.
For the recording, Amy mentions that we probably need more than 3 people in the room.
Yeah. That's fair.
I'd say that this is, I would also, so having the refinement section about do they reflect real pain, and I would also add that like that's primarily a negative analysis. You also want a positive analysis to go with it. So for example, Fedora changes don't actually focus on pain as part of the description. They focus on solutioning and benefits. And if you are doing a refinement around this, you want to have solutioning as the primary focus, because otherwise all you're doing is griping.
Yeah, we discovered this, Neal, and that's what I was saying. Typically, the way we do this internally is you have to have a market problem and a feature set pair that would help retire that market problem. And that's what you come back with as a straw man, because if you don't come up with some features that would solve it, it's not very fun.
And like, I think this is the reason why, like, if you look at Fedora change templates, we explicitly don't mention problem domains. Because they're not helpful if you're already like working on and making a solution, but we request benefit analysis, which indirectly it's the positive version of the pain. So like it's inverted. But I think that that's also a better way when you're thinking about, like, when you're solutioning, you probably want to think about it from the positive analysis. When you're problem solving, which I know they sound like the same thing. I promise you they're not exactly the same. But when you're problem solving, you want the negative analysis, because you want to understand the domain of issues that you need to actually deal with.
Yeah.
Solutioning is you already have the idea of what you want to do and why. But problem solving is you don't necessarily know yet, but you need to scope what the domains are to create a solution.
No, I agree. And I saw Amy had her hand up. Because we have 2 minutes, I wanted to at least see, did she want to chime in? Because you put it back down, and then that worried me.
Yeah, no, because Neal took it in a different direction. I think what we need is people to represent the communities, people to represent the areas within Red Hat, make sure OSPA's represented, the BU's represented. That's why I say you need more than 3 people in the room, so you get everybody's viewpoints.
Yep.
Because not everyone thinks it's the same way. Therefore, you're missing out on things.
No, I agree 100. No, that's a brilliant idea. That's exactly. Yeah, my first like litmus test was like, at a minimum, you need somebody from RHEL, Fedora, and CentOS. But then, yes, you're right. There are other constituencies that would be great. That is the idea. In fact, I'll share an article I just wrote about this. Like, I believe whenever anything good happens, you almost have to have all the different constituencies in earlier than you think. Because when you bring a 90% baked idea, it's just the human nature to want to reject it, because you're like, you're basically telling me what to do. Like, it's way better to have all those people in early and touch it and feel and like want to solve the problem. So I agree violently with you, Amy. That is my way of saying that. Brendan, please.
Is this the closing slide?
Yeah. Yep. This is the closing slide.
All right. I feel like the conversation has just started. So what is a good next step? Do we want to like play with something a week from now, or what do you think?
Yeah, you're right. Maybe all of us as a whole could hack on one of those market problems, even as a full team. That would even just to like get our legs under us.
Jef.
Okay. Because I know I'm on the hook. If I get the sandbox proposal out for discussion, can we then use that as a straw proposal and knock it down and beat it up and try to work that first proposal, using the straw proposal as a first cut as a solution?
I would be open to that, of course. But I will let others chime in.
Can we just do a quick straw poll? There's like an emoji button in the middle. It's a smiley face. So I'm going to count to 5, and on 5, I want you to do a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or I'm not sure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, thumbs up.
All right, we're somewhere between and thumbs up. So why don't we do that next week?
Yay, I have homework.
Yeah, we get to force Jef, a forcing function for Jef. I love it.
Yeah, accountability is important.
Nice. All right, well, let's call it here then. Scott, thank you for the splendid deck. You don't need to apologize for using a tool to make it look nice. And
I feel like guilt, Brendan. I had to like get my guilt off my conscience.
I know. And I think for some people are like, guy, he used the thing. Anyway, again, we are recorded. And in a few minutes, the results of this call will get published to YouTube. There will be, if we mention any follow-on things that we were going to do in the interim, it'll show up as JIRA tickets, and they'll all get pointed back into the Freckle channel. So thanks for joining today. Thanks for joining the conversation. And I will see you next week, if not sooner. Bye all.